Sitting alone at the wedding feast, the Omega heard the Alpha murmur, "Stand here with me." Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character, Elena Moore. Elena Moore sat at the far edge of the wedding feast where the candlelight thinned and the music softened, a place chosen not by chance, but by quiet consensus, the kind no one ever admits to making. The hall stretched wide and warm, polished oak floors reflecting chandeliers like small constellations, laughter drifting in gentle waves from table to table, yet around Elena there was a pocket of stillness, as if the celebration politely stepped around her presence. She wore a simple dress in pale ivory, pressed carefully that morning with borrowed steam, sleeves smooth, posture straight, hands folded because it felt safer to keep them busy. She watched servers pass with silver trays, heard the clink of glassware, smelled roasted herbs and sweet bread, and felt the familiar weight of being seen without being chosen. Elena was an Omega, and tonight the word hovered in the air like a footnote everyone knew by heart. She had been invited because tradition insisted on completeness, because a feast looked fuller when every seat held a body, not because anyone expected her to belong. When she smiled, it was returned late or not at all. When she stood to make room for others, no one noticed she had moved. The bride glowed at the center of the room, veiled in joy, surrounded by well-wishers who leaned in close. And Elena felt happy for her in the honest way that never earned applause. She took a sip of water, set the glass down carefully so it wouldn't ring too loud, and reminded herself that she could leave early, that slipping out quietly had become a skill. Then the doors opened. It wasn't the sound that changed the room so much as the pause, the collective breath drawn at once, the way chairs straightened and conversations learned. Restraint. The Alpha entered with measured steps, presence steady, gaze calm, authority worn like a tailored coat rather than armor. Elena didn't look at him at first. She had learned how attention could burn when it wasn't meant for you. She focused on the linen napkin beneath her fingers, counted the threads, and waited for the moment to pass. But it didn't. A shadow fell gently across the edge of her table, not heavy, not demanding, just enough to be noticed. When she looked up, the Alpha's eyes were on her, not curious, not appraising, simply certain, and in that certainty there was no hurry. He leaned just close enough that his voice reached her without reaching anyone else, a low murmur shaped for only one listener, and said, "Stand here with me." The words landed softly and changed the room all the same, because silence learned a new meaning when an Alpha chose where it would settle. Elena did not move at first, because for a heartbeat she thought she had misunderstood him, thought the words were meant for someone just behind her shoulder, someone more appropriate, someone whose presence would not bend the air. Around them, the hall remained perfectly still, the kind of stillness that comes when everyone senses a shift, but no one yet knows its shape. She could hear her own breathing, slow and careful, and the soft rustle of her dress as she rose, because the Alpha was still there, hand offered not as a command but an invitation that carried its own gravity. When her fingers touched his, it was warm, steady, unmistakably real, and she stood because the alternative would have been to deny the moment itself. As they moved, chairs subtly angled away to make space, not out of fear but out of instinct, and Elena felt the curious sensation of being guided without being led, her steps matching his as if the floor had learned them both. They stopped near the head table where light gathered brighter, where faces were easier to read, and only then did the murmurs begin, soft at first, then restrained, because restraint is what people choose when they are unsure how to respond. Elena kept her chin level, eyes forward, posture calm, reminding herself that she was still the same person who had arrived alone, still the Omega who had learned how to occupy small spaces with grace. The difference was not in her, she realized, but in where she was allowed to stand. The Alpha released her hand and positioned himself beside her, not in front, not behind, simply there, and that choice spoke louder than any announcement. He did not look down at her, nor did he scan the room for approval. He looked outward, as if this arrangement had always been obvious. Elena became aware of details she had missed before, the subtle cadence of his breathing, the way his presence anchored the space without dominating it, and she understood that attention could be quiet and still be complete. Someone poured champagne nearby, the soft pop echoing, and the celebration cautiously resumed, though the rhythm had changed, recalibrated around a new center. Elena felt eyes on her back, on her hands, on the space she occupied, and she did not shrink, because shrinking would have suggested doubt where there was none. The Alpha spoke to the bride with courtesy, offered congratulations that sounded sincere, and when he turned back, his glance toward Elena was brief and assured, as if to say she was exactly where she belonged. She exhaled, a tension she had carried for years easing not because it was erased, but because it was finally acknowledged. Standing there, Elena understood something simple and profound, that belonging was not always earned through endurance or silence, that sometimes it arrived because someone with the power to choose decided to see you fully and say, without spectacle, without apology, stand here. Elena remained beside the Alpha as the feast carried on, and with each passing minute the initial shock softened into a strange new normal that no one quite dared to question. Conversation resumed in careful tones, laughter returned in measured bursts, yet the space around them stayed respectfully clear, as if the room itself understood an invisible boundary. Elena noticed how people looked at her differently now, not with warmth exactly, but with reconsideration, the subtle recalculations of those who realized they might have misjudged a moment too soon. She kept her shoulders relaxed and her gaze steady, listening more than speaking, allowing the noise to wash around her without pulling her under. When a server approached with a tray, uncertain where to stand, the Alpha shifted half a step to give him room, a small courtesy that carried weight, and Elena saw how authority could be practiced without display. She accepted a glass, thanked the server softly, and felt a flicker of confidence settle where anxiety had once lived. Nearby, a group of guests paused mid-sentence when they noticed her attention, then continued with polite smiles, and Elena recognized the pattern, the way acceptance often arrived wrapped in caution before it learned ease. The Alpha spoke quietly to an elder she recognized from council meetings, his tone calm and respectful, and when the elder glanced at Elena, the Alpha made no introduction, no explanation, simply allowed the presence to speak for itself. That omission mattered more than a title would have. Elena remembered all the times she had been asked to explain herself, to justify her place, and she realized no one was asking now. As the evening unfolded, music shifted to a slower cadence, the lights dimmed slightly, and couples began to drift toward the floor. Elena stayed where she was, content to observe, until the Alpha turned toward her again, his expression thoughtful, not expectant, and asked if she was comfortable. She nodded, surprised by the question, surprised that her comfort had become a consideration rather than an afterthought. He acknowledged her answer with a slight inclination of his head, and they stood together, watching the dance form and reform like a living pattern. Elena sensed the room studying them in return, waiting for cues, but the Alpha offered none, remaining composed, unhurried, as if time bent gently around him. In that steadiness, Elena found room to breathe. She thought of how often she had been taught to take up less space, to avoid attention, to smooth herself into the background for the sake of peace, and she realized this moment did not ask her to be louder or different, only present. The Alpha glanced at her once more, a quiet assurance passing between them without words, and Elena understood that this was not a performance or a favor, but a choice made openly and sustained without effort. Standing there, she felt something shift inside her, not a sudden transformation, but a grounding, the certainty that she did not need to disappear to belong, and that sometimes being seen began with someone deciding you were worth standing beside. As the night deepened, the wedding feast settled into a quieter rhythm, the kind that came after excitement had burned itself into memory and left behind something steadier. Elena noticed how the Alpha remained beside her without effort, never crowding her space, never drifting away, his presence consistent enough that it began to feel natural. Guests approached in small numbers now, offering polite words, measured smiles, their curiosity carefully tempered by respect. Elena answered when spoken to, her voice calm, her expression sincere, and she felt the unfamiliar ease of not being dismissed mid-sentence. When someone addressed the alpha and included her in the exchange without hesitation, she felt the subtle affirmation settle like a warm weight across her shoulders. At one point, a young woman she barely recognized paused nearby, clearly uncertain, then offered Elena a compliment about her dress, simple and unadorned, and Elena thanked her with a genuine smile, surprised by how easily it came. The alpha observed these interactions without comment, as if he were listening not just to words but to the shifts beneath them, and Elena sensed that he had chosen this moment with care, allowing the room to adjust at its own pace. Music swelled again, softer now, and a few couples laughed as they navigated the dance floor, while others lingered at the edges, content to watch. Elena found herself watching too, not from the margins as she once had, but from a place that felt central without being exposed. She realized that standing beside the alpha did not erase her past or the way she had learned to endure, but it reframed it, giving those experiences a context that felt acknowledged rather than hidden. The alpha spoke to her quietly then, asking if she would like to step outside for a moment, not as an escape, but as a choice, and she appreciated that distinction more than she could explain. Together, they moved toward the terrace doors, the night air cool and clean as it greeted them, carrying the faint scent of flowers and distant pine. Elena rested her hands lightly on the railing, looking out over the grounds where lanterns traced gentle paths, and felt the tension of the evening loosen another degree. The alpha stood beside her, close enough to be reassuring, far enough to give her space, and for a moment neither spoke. In the quiet, Elena became aware of her own heartbeat, steady and strong, and she understood that she was not waiting for permission anymore. When the alpha finally spoke, his words were simple, telling her she had handled the evening with grace, and there was no surprise in his tone, as if he had expected nothing less. Elena met his gaze then, holding it without flinching, and thanked him for the invitation that had changed the course of her night. He nodded once, acknowledging the exchange as equal, and in that gesture she felt something settle into place, a sense of balance she had never known she was missing. They stood there a moment longer, the music drifting faintly behind them, and Elena realized that whatever came next, she would remember this evening not as the night she was rescued, but as the night she was chosen to stand exactly where she was. When they returned inside, the atmosphere had shifted again, quieter but charged with expectation, as if the room sensed that the evening had crossed an invisible threshold. Elena noticed how the alpha resumed his place beside her without ceremony, as though nothing unusual had occurred, and that simplicity grounded her more than any declaration could have. Guests no longer hesitated when their eyes met hers. Some inclined their heads politely, others offered small smiles that felt practiced yet sincere. Elena accepted these gestures without measuring them, understanding that change often arrived in stages rather than all at once. The bride passed nearby, radiant and composed, and paused just long enough to thank Elena for coming, her tone warm, her gaze steady, and Elena returned the thanks with genuine goodwill, feeling a quiet closure settle over the moment. Music softened further, signaling the approach of evening's end, and servers began clearing plates with efficient grace. The alpha spoke briefly with the hosts, his words respectful and concise, then turned back to Elena, asking if she was ready to leave whenever she wished. The question surprised her again, not because it was offered, but because it assumed her preference mattered. Elena considered the room one last time, the tables, the lights, the faces that had learned her presence anew, and nodded. As they moved toward the exit, the space opened easily before them, and Elena realized she was no longer counting steps or planning her escape. Outside, the night had cooled, the air carrying a gentle hush that wrapped around them as the doors closed behind. They walked at an unhurried pace along the lantern-lit path, their footsteps in quiet sync, and Elena felt a sense of completion she had not anticipated. She thought of all the gatherings she had attended where she had faded into the background, where endurance had been mistaken for virtue, and she understood now that endurance alone was not the measure of worth. The alpha slowed near the edge of the grounds and paused, giving her space to speak or not speak as she chose. Elena broke the silence first, telling him that his invitation had changed more than the evening for her, that it had shifted something she had carried for a long time. Her voice remained calm, but the truth in it felt solid. He listened without interruption, then acknowledged her words with quiet sincerity, telling her that presence deserved recognition, and that choosing to see someone was never an accident. There was no promise in his tone, no expectation set, only an honesty that felt complete in itself. Elena absorbed that, realizing she did not need the night to become anything more than it already was to matter. As they continued toward the waiting cars, Elena felt steady, aware that tomorrow would bring questions, assumptions, and the slow work of adjustment. But tonight had given her something enduring. She had stood where she was asked to stand, and in doing so, she had discovered that belonging could begin with a single choice, made openly, and carried forward with quiet respect. The following morning arrived with a clarity Elena had not expected, as if the night had rinsed the world clean and left her thoughts sharper, steadier. Sunlight filtered through tall windows in her small apartment, catching on familiar details that suddenly felt newly hers, and she stood for a moment with a cup of coffee warming her hands, replaying the evening without urgency. There were no grand declarations waiting in her memory, no promises that demanded interpretation, only a sequence of choices made with care, and that made them easier to trust. Later that day, word traveled the way it always did, not through announcements, but through glances that lingered, messages sent with cautious phrasing, invitations extended with polite curiosity. Elena noticed it first when she stepped into a neighborhood cafe and the barista greeted her by name, a simple courtesy that felt newly deliberate. She ordered her usual, took a seat by the window, and observed how people oriented themselves toward her presence with subtle shifts, as if recalibrating their understanding of who she was allowed to be. By midday, a formal envelope arrived, understated and precise, inviting her to attend a council gathering later in the week as an observer, no explanation attached. Elena read it twice, then set it down gently, recognizing the significance without letting it rush her. She understood now that attention could arrive quietly and still alter the landscape. That afternoon, she encountered the Alpha again, not at a grand hall or formal event, but during a brief stop at a community center where he was speaking with local leaders. Their eyes met across the room, and he offered a nod of acknowledgement that carried the same calm assurance as before. There was no claim in it, no urgency, only continuity, and Elena returned the gesture with equal composure. They spoke briefly afterward, exchanging practical words about schedules and shared responsibilities. The conversation grounded and respectful, and Elena appreciated that nothing was rushed into meaning it had not yet earned. As the days progressed, she felt herself moving through familiar spaces with a different awareness, not elevated, not guarded, simply present. When someone asked her opinion in a meeting and listened through to the end, she answered without hesitation. When she was invited to sit closer to the center rather than the edge, she accepted without apology. The Alpha remained a steady presence at a distance, attentive without intrusion, and Elena understood that whatever was unfolding did not depend on spectacle to sustain itself. One evening, as she walked home under a sky turning gold at the edges, Elena reflected on how easily the world could change when one moment was allowed to stand unchallenged. She realized that the invitation she had accepted was still working its way outward, not as a story to be repeated, but as a quiet recalibration of what was possible. And in that understanding, she felt prepared, not for a destiny written by others, but for a path shaped by mutual recognition, steady choice, and the confidence to remain exactly where she had been asked to stand. The council gathering took place 3 days later in a chamber Elena had only ever seen from a distance, its high windows casting measured light across long tables polished smooth by decades of careful use. She arrived early, not out of nerves but habit, and chose a seat along the side as indicated, hands folded, posture composed. Conversations flowed around her with the low hum of routine governance, voices calm, deliberate, and she listened, absorbing the cadence of decision-making that shaped daily life more than any celebration ever could. When the Alpha entered, the room acknowledged him with practiced respect, then returned to business, and Elena noted with quiet satisfaction that no one questioned her presence or asked her to justify it. Midway through the meeting, a discussion arose concerning community outreach and representation, and an elder referenced Elena's recent work by name, inviting her perspective without ceremony. The moment was small but precise, and Elena spoke with clarity, offering her thoughts without embellishment, trusting that being heard did not require performance. The alpha listened from across the table, expression attentive, and when he spoke afterward, he echoed her point without credit or correction, reinforcing it as part of the shared direction rather than a singular contribution. Elena understood then how support could operate in plain sight, strengthening without overshadowing. As the meeting concluded, members lingered in quiet clusters, exchanging follow-up details, and Elena gathered her notes, preparing to leave as she always had. Before she could step away, the alpha approached, not drawing attention, simply aligning his pace with hers as they walked toward the exit. He asked if she would be willing to attend future sessions regularly, not as an observer, but as a participant, and the invitation was delivered without pressure, framed as a question rather than an expectation. Elena considered it carefully, aware of the significance, then accepted, her voice steady, her choice deliberate. Outside, the afternoon sun warmed the stone steps, and people passed them with nods of recognition that felt unforced. Elena sensed the shift settling further into place, not as rumor, but as routine. Over the following days, the pattern held. Invitations arrived with her name printed clearly, responsibilities expanded naturally, and her contributions were received with thoughtful engagement rather than surprise. The alpha remained present but never possessive, his consistency allowing space rather than claiming it, and Elena found that trust grew best in that environment. One evening, at a modest reception hosted by local leaders, Elena noticed how she moved through the room with ease, greeted by peers who sought her input and welcomed her perspective. The alpha joined her briefly, exchanging a few words that confirmed plans already discussed, then stepped away, leaving her fully within the circle she had earned. As the night wound down, Elena stood near a window overlooking the city lights, reflecting on the sequence of moments that had brought her here, not as a sudden ascent, but as a series of doors quietly opened and held. She realized that recognition, once given, carried responsibility as well as opportunity, and she felt ready to meet both. In the calm certainty of that understanding, Elena recognized the deeper shift that had taken place, not just in how others saw her, but in how she now chose to remain visible, grounded, and fully present in the space she occupied. The moment that followed did not arrive with ceremony, but with a quiet inevitability that Elena felt before she could name it. It happened during a public forum held in the Central Hall, a place where citizens gathered to hear updates and offer concerns, the kind of setting where presence carried meaning even without words. Elena stood among other speakers, notes prepared, heart steady, aware of the audience's attention but no longer shaped by it. When her turn came, she spoke about access, about listening, about the importance of making space for voices that had learned to speak softly because they were seldom invited to speak at all. Her words were measured and practical, grounded in experience rather than emotion, and the room listened in a way that felt complete. When she finished, there was a pause, then a ripple of approval that did not seek to overwhelm but to affirm. The alpha rose after her, not immediately, allowing her contribution to stand on its own, and when he addressed the room, he referenced her points directly, reinforcing them as part of the shared path forward. He did not elevate her above others, nor did he dilute her impact, and Elena understood the balance being demonstrated. Afterward, as the gathering dispersed, conversations clustered around her with genuine engagement, questions asked with respect, suggestions exchanged as equals. Elena moved through them calmly, answering what she could, noting what required follow-up, aware that she was no longer an exception but a participant. Outside, the city hummed with late afternoon energy, and the alpha joined her at the edge of the steps, the crowd thinning naturally around them. He told her that her voice carried weight because it was consistent, because it aligned thought with action, and because she did not disappear when attention arrived. Elena accepted the acknowledgement without deflection, understanding that confidence did not require apology. He then did something simple and definitive, something visible enough to be understood without explanation. He positioned himself beside her, facing outward toward the remaining onlookers, not to announce a claim, but to make a truth undeniable. The gesture echoed the night of the wedding feast, but now it unfolded in daylight, in the ordinary flow of civic life, and its effect was immediate and lasting. People noticed, not with shock this time, but with recognition, as if a pattern had completed itself. Elena felt the shift ripple outward, the last doubts dissolving into clarity. Standing there, she realized this was the moment when uncertainty gave way to understanding, when what had begun as an invitation settled into a shared reality. There were no cheers, no declarations, only a steady acceptance that recalibrated the space they occupied. The Alpha spoke quietly to her then, saying that he would continue to stand with her where it mattered, and that her presence had strengthened the work they were doing. Elena met his gaze, seeing not dominance but partnership, and nodded once, the simplicity of the exchange reflecting its depth. As they walked away together, Elena felt the weight of old assumptions finally lift, replaced by something more enduring than validation. She had not been rescued, corrected, or transformed. She had been seen, chosen, and respected in full view, and the world had adjusted accordingly. In that adjustment, Elena recognized the quiet justice of the moment, the fulfillment of a shift that did not demand spectacle to prove its worth, only the courage to stand openly and remain. The season turned quietly, as seasons often do, without announcement, and Elena noticed the change not in headlines or formal notices, but in the way daily life settled into a steadier rhythm around her. Mornings began with purpose rather than preparation for defense, afternoons filled with work that invited collaboration instead of tolerance, evenings ending with the calm satisfaction of having contributed something that would last beyond the moment. She moved through meetings, public spaces, and familiar streets with the same composure she had learned long ago, but now it was met with recognition rather than dismissal. The Alpha remained a consistent presence in her orbit, never defining her role, never eclipsing it, standing with her when alignment mattered, and stepping back when independence served better. Over time, people stopped remarking on the pairing and began responding to the results. Policies shaped by listening, initiatives grounded in inclusion, progress marked by steadiness rather than spectacle. Elena found herself mentoring others who had once sat where she used to sit, on the edges of rooms, unsure whether their voices would carry. She did not offer speeches or assurances, only attention, and that attention proved enough. One evening, as dusk softened the city into shades of gold and gray, Elena stood on a terrace overlooking the lights below, reflecting on how a single invitation had unfolded into a life reshaped by choice rather than chance. The Alpha joined her without ceremony, leaning lightly against the railing, sharing the view without claiming it. They spoke of practical matters first, schedules, upcoming sessions, the ordinary work that sustained what had been built, then allowed the conversation to rest. In the quiet, Elena recognized how far she had come from the night she had sat alone, not because the world had transformed overnight, but because she had remained present when it mattered. The Alpha broke the silence with a simple observation, that leadership was not measured by how loudly one was followed, but by how many others learned to stand confidently on their own. Elena smiled, understanding the truth of it, understanding that her place beside him had never been about elevation, only alignment. As the evening deepened, they turned back toward the interior lights, walking side by side at an unhurried pace, the ease between them earned rather than assumed. Elena felt no need to mark the moment, no desire to name it as an ending or a beginning. It was simply a continuation of what had already been set in motion. She knew there would be challenges ahead, disagreements, days that tested patience and resolve, but she also knew she would meet them without shrinking. The invitation she had accepted had become a standard she lived by, to stand openly, to remain visible, to choose presence over retreat. In that choice, she found a strength that did not need defense and a belonging that did not require permission. As the doors closed behind them and the city settled into night, Elena carried with her the quiet certainty that her place was no longer defined by where she was seated, but by where she chose to stand, and that choice, once made, continued to shape the world around her with calm, enduring clarity.